You're listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I am here with my friend Cathy Loerzel, who's been on the podcast a number of times and is one of the founders of the Allender Center and the new author of the book Redeeming Heartache. Cathy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Adam. So glad to be here again.
We are going to talk today about how to engage another person's story. It's one thing to engage your own story, and we talk about that a lot on this podcast, but it's a whole nother ballgame to talk about how do you go about engaging a friend's story or your partner's story or a coworker's story. So the question for today is, how do you engage another person's story well? And another way of saying that is, how can you be with them in a way that brings healing and freedom to them? And I want to start out by disposing of a myth that I think is common. And here's the myth. You have to be a super duper counselor therapist type with magical powers to really know how to engage someone's story well. This is a myth. Engaging someone's story is part art, it's part science, but it can be learned. It's not a magical ability that some people have and some people don't. There are certain principles that apply, and we're going to talk about that today. And these principles can be learned. That's the science part. And then I think there are skills that need to be caught by watching other people engage stories. And I consider that the art part. So, Cathy, when you were first introduced to story work and you first began engaging other people's stories, were you any good at it?
I love that this is where you're starting. No, I'll go at it from two angles. One, the way I started to engage this work is because I found myself in lots of situations where people were telling me their stories because I was willing to listen. And because I had a sense of the agony of the human heart and the reality that we live at a different playing field than what's true underneath the surface. And so because I was open to that, people would come all the time. And all of a sudden, as a teenager, as a college kid working with high schoolers, all of a sudden people were telling me their abuse stories, things that were going on currently, things that had happened in the past, their deepest, darkest secrets. And I was there, and I was a compassionate listener. So what I started to realize was that I could do open heart surgery. I knew something was wrong, but then all of a sudden, these teenage kids or college kids would be laid out on my operating table, and I had no idea how to put them back together again. And so I kept getting caught in these places where I was really over my skis in terms of my capacity. I could listen, but I didn't know what to do after that. And I was actually doing some damage because I was willing to listen, which again, I think there's something so good about that. But I didn't know where to go. And then I would kind of get scared because I was like, oh, shoot, we're in some really treacherous territory here. I know that this person is just really struggling, and I don't know where to go from here. And so then, because of my own story, I would withdraw from them because I would get freaked out. And so I started to see that pattern. And then that's why I ended up in grad school, because studying psychology, because I realized there's something here in my story where I long to be able to do this well, but I'm realizing that I don't have the tool set to do that yet. So I started to pursue it. And then, so I got into grad school, sat with Dan. Dan was my practicum. So in grad school, you do kind of like small group supervision work where you kind of start to practice how to do it. And Dan was my practicum leader. And I got probably 5 minutes into a facilitation before he stopped me. It was like, hey, do you know where you're going? And I'm like, hey, I'm going to kill you right now. No, I do not. Please help, And so it's really hard to start to learn how to do it, but it takes a lot of humility, a lot of practice, but more than anything, a willingness to stay present and to stay connected and just keep going to get there. So how about you? How were you when you started?
The two words that come to mind for me is I would feel lost and I would feel overwhelmed. I had no framework for understanding story, and I had no idea what to say or how to respond to someone when they were done telling a story. So I could offer empathy if there was tragedy, heartache, abuse in a story, but I had no sense of what I wanted for the storyteller, no sense of what I wanted to invite the storyteller to step into more fully, explore in more depth. In other words, I didn't know I didn't know what to say that would bring the storyteller something of freedom and healing. And now, after the training that you did for me and other people at the Allender Center, I can read a story in 10 minutes and have a pretty clear sense of where the storyteller is bound and what parts of the story I want to engage and what direction I want to go in. So the point is, you can learn how to engage another person's story well. It can be learned. You've learned it. I've learned it, and we didn't know how to do it when we came out of the womb.
Right.
So you and I care deeply about teaching people how to do this, and we are going to that end, co-teach a virtual conference on this subject, how to engage another person's story. And that one-day conference will be held on Saturday, February 19th from 8 to 4 Pacific time, which is 11 to 7 Eastern time. So if after listening to this episode, you want to learn more about how to engage another person's story, whoever that other person is, a friend, a client, whatever, you can sign up for this virtual conference, February 19th, from my website, adamyoungcounseling.com. And we're going to share more about what to expect at the conference later. But first, let's just step into a scenario. So, Cathy, let's say that you're having coffee with a friend. Your friend shares a story of harm, pain, heartache from their growing up years. How are you supposed to think about what you have just heard?
One, let me just premise by saying, there is certain story work that you can do through friendships, through sitting with one another, that we are all meant to do, to just care for each other, to be in each other's worlds and each other's stories. There are also levels of story work that need to be done with a professional. And so just to start with that baseline, where we are saying, as friends, as partners, as people in this work, like we have a responsibility to show up for one another and to be able to be in complex emotions, and to not feel like you should just be able to go and do really intense work around an abuse story, that it's okay to recognize that you are beyond what you know how to do. When I'm sitting with someone and we're friends, we're talking, this isn't necessarily a story workshop or a story engagement, right? I am always wanting to put my body into the middle of their movie. I love stories, I love movies, I love TV shows, and I love it because you can almost give your body over to a story. And so the way that you start to understand what the story is telling you is by putting your body and your mind in the midst of it so that you can start to see it. And it goes from kind of black and white to technicolor, where you start to understand what they're feeling. You really move into an empathetic position by being able to say, okay, well, what would I feel if I was in the midst of this story? What am I connecting to that's scary, that's agonizing, that's heartbreaking, that's confusing? And I really give myself over to it so that it can kind of wash over me, and then I can understand where they need tending. And really it's just a sense of where do they need connection and attunement, and me coming alongside of them to even just say, oh my gosh, this is agonizing. And so often when we're in the midst of heartache and trauma, we lose language. And so for a witness to be able to be in someone else's story and even have the clarity of mind to bring some more language to someone is so helpful. So even the words of like, oh my gosh, this is agonizing. Like the idea of agony is different than a sense of, oh, this is scary, or this is troubling, or I feel anxious, right? And so even for you to start to understand what's the language that you can start to bring to other people's stories by really almost allowing your body to drop into their story and be able to be used. And I use the word used in a good way, not in an abusive way, but almost like a vessel that will give you more clarity and more capacity to really understand what you're hearing in your body. But if your body isn't available because of your own trauma, because of the places that you are still working out, you're not going to be able to do that on behalf of another person. And that's why we always go back to, you can only take someone as far as you're willing to go yourself. So where you're backing out of your own body's, capacity to hear a story because of your own harm, that's where you'll also not be able to listen to another person's story well.
So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of being embodied. Are you saying that if the storyteller shares a story of when she's 13, that you attempt to experience that 13-year-old's world as she tells you the story?
Absolutely.
And how do you go about doing that?
I think you use all of our good and holy imaginations and memories for what it was like to be that 13-year-old. Let's arc out the narrative a little bit of this woman. So I'm sitting next to a woman, and she's talking about when she was 13, and her mom left her alone with a 19-year-old guy that she had met at a hotel they were staying at, and she went out to dinner, left her 13-year-old, right? And so this woman's coming to me and saying, I had this weird memory, this thing came up, and it felt normal at the time, but now I'm thinking maybe something's off, right? So immediately I'm going to put myself into a situation of saying, okay, so a 13-year-old when is young, has no business being alone with a 19-year-old boy, guy, man. And so what in the world is going on in this situation, and what terror would this 13-year-old, what war would this 13-year-old be in the midst of this story, right? So my assumption right away is that a 13-year-old feels like they're a lot older than they actually are. So they feel like they're an adult, like they should be left alone with this 19-year-old. They feel like, they're being responsible, and, they're excited. But also there's a terror underneath it of the exposure and the vulnerability that's left when the mother has kind of set her up to be alone with this guy. Right. And so you're going to start to create an imagination. So even as I talk about that, my body starts to tingle. I feel the threat of like, oh my gosh, a 13-year-old with a 19-year-old, that's a really big age gap, and experience gap. And so I start to feel the threat of like what happened, what could have happened, the exposure, the vulnerability, and what in the world was that mother playing out, by putting her daughter at risk in that way. So that's what you're starting to feel right away. And if you put your body in it, then you can start to feel the danger, the risk, the arousal of the moment, both the arousal of fear and the arousal of being wanted or being desired as a 13-year-old, right? So you start to get into the water of this very complex situation. And immediately your senses are more alivened to this other person's story. And you're now available to actually be with them as a witness and to be able to say, oh my gosh, this is awful. Also, you would have been feeling all of these different elements simultaneously as a 13-year-old, which would have overwhelmed your systems.
This is one of the, I would say, principles of effective story engagement, and that is to be embodied yourself as the listener in such a way that you're able to connect not just with the adult storyteller across the table from you, but far more with the boy or the girl in the story.
Mhm.
And it's a principle, of engaging a story well. And I want to share a couple more principles now, and let's just talk through them, and we'll engage these in much more detail at the conference. Here is, for me, this is like principle number one, numero uno, the most important thing when it comes to story engagement. And maybe this is just for me, but it's a North Star for me. And that is that attunement to the storyteller is more important than engaging their story brilliantly. Whenever you are engaging someone's story, the temptation, especially when you're kind of new at this was so true for me. The temptation is to be thinking so hard about how to engage the story well and what's going on in this story that you lose the face of the person right in front of you. And this has happened to me more times than I care to remember. So, principle number one of effective story engagement is that attunement to the person you're talking to is more important than, we could say, story acumen.
Mhm.
Now, what do I mean by attunement? To attune to someone is to pay attention to their nonverbal communication, especially their facial expression, their tone of voice. It is to track their emotions and their bodily sensations. Because no matter how brilliant you are at engaging someone's story, if you're not attuned to what's happening for them in the present, you're going to miss them and they are not going to feel joined by you. Questions like, what are you feeling in your body right now, will allow you to track with their inner experience. What are you experiencing in your chest, your stomach, your throat? These questions, there are questions you can ask that allow you to track with the storyteller's affect, what's going on in their body. And they allow you to stay attuned to the storyteller's like inner experience right now, right after they've told their story, for example, or as you're exploring that 13-year-old sitting across the table from a 19-year-old. And this attunement will make the storyteller feel felt. They will feel joined. They will feel like you care about how the story is affecting them, and not only about doing a great job at engaging their story. And for me, when I realized that my primary deliverable as a therapist is attunement, it's not to be some brilliant story engager. The primary goal of sitting with someone is attunement. There's a lot of freedom in that because I don't have to be Jesus. I don't have to know what the storyteller is feeling and thinking. I can ask questions like, how is your heart right now after reading or telling me that story
Mhm.
about you as a 13-year-old and your mom has left you with a 19-year-old? I can ask the question, what are you feeling about what I just said? Because there's so much of this work that involves trial and error and really playfulness. So you're going to say some things and they're going to react to what you say. And you're allowed to say, your face just changed a bit. What are you doing with my words? So you have to stay with the storyteller's present experience throughout the process. And I imagine, Cathy, you have had the experience of feeling like you were doing really great story work with someone, and then you realize that you were so committed to your interpretation of their story that you missed them, that you weren't attuned to them, that they were in a different place than you were. Uh, am I imagining correctly? You've had that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to do this work perfectly, right? And so the sooner we understand that rupture is inevitable, that we are human beings, we are flawed, we're not going to be able to read people like Jesus was able to read people. There is a freedom that comes from that because then there's also the freedom to repair. This work is this is going to sound weird, but it's so fun because it's like being a detective. It's like Sherlock Holmes in the middle of a story, and you're like, okay, like what is this going to look like? And I can get way ahead of anyone that I'm working with if I already feel like I know the end. I think I know where they should go. If they just acknowledge, so let's talk about this woman that, I'm sitting with, where we're talking about her as a 13-year-old. Like, I'm furious in that moment with her mom. And I'm like, this mom is setting you up. She is putting you in this position that's insanely dangerous. So, at the end of the line, I'm like, your mom hates you and she's pimping you out. That's where I want to get to, right? Well, this woman's not ready for that. She's nowhere near. She's just starting to acknowledge that this may have been off, because the way she's written this story is that she was a mature 13-year-old, and she's proud of the fact that, one, her mom let her do this, and that this 19-year-old guy thought she was attractive enough to want to be with her as a 13-year-old, right? So that's how she's rewritten the story. So she's just coming to grips with the fact that maybe something was off, right? But what we know about neuroscience is that her body knew something was off back then. She could read the fact that this wasn't okay, but she's had to rewrite it in order to make everything work in her life, right? So you have to be very careful and without demand when you step into someone's story, even if you feel like you know the end game. You got to hold that to yourself until you feel like you've stayed with them long enough. And so you never want to get out ahead of someone else when you're doing this work. You always want to stay with them. And that's where attunement comes in, because you can tell when you've left someone in the dirt. I mean, their face freezes, they go away, they start to dissociate. So if you have a lens to start to see that, you can lean in and say, okay, I feel like maybe I got a little ahead of us. I'm sorry. That was my fault. Let's go back to this, to where we were still connected, where there was still attunement. And then you can go back. But the more you give yourself grace for where you're going to be eager, where you're going to shut down, or where you're going to lose someone, the more you have grace for yourself, the more freedom you can bring to these engagements. Because, if you're not, there's no way that you can be Jesus, then all you can do is repair and then keep going. Because the reality is, most people are more afraid of you leaving them in the midst of the rupture than they are about the capacity to repair. So the worst case scenario for folks is when you realize, oh my gosh, I missed this person. And then you feel shame. You then start to withdraw, you wrap it up, and then you leave, and you're paying for your coffee on the way out. Like, no, this person needs you to be able to say, hey, I missed you, but I'm still here. Let's keep going.
Okay, another principle of effective story engagement: courage and kindness will take you further than skill at reading story. So good story engagement, in my mind, it starts in your gut. It starts with a deep desire in your gut for the storyteller to experience freedom where they are bound. And as you're taken into their world through their story, and as you start to live in this movie that they're telling you about, you have to want things for them that they may not yet want for themselves. So when I say courage and kindness, remember, kindness it's not the same as niceness. Niceness is not going to be very helpful to a storyteller. They don't need merely a listening ear. There's too much shame, confusion, ambivalence, powerlessness, all sorts of big emotions in their stories for a listening ear to be sufficient to help them. What they need, what I need when I tell a story of harm, I need someone with the courage and the kindness to risk naming truth in the story that I may not yet see. And so here's a quote from our mentor and friend, Dan Allender. I love this quote. He says that only two things are really required to begin engaging someone's story well: humility and courage.
Mm.
Skill will eventually follow. Boy, is that freeing. Those are Dan's words. Only two things are required to begin engaging someone's story: humility, and courage. Skill will eventually follow. So, Cathy, what comes up for you when you think about having your story engaged by someone with the willingness to courageously risk and the willingness to be kind, as opposed to someone who's reluctant to really step in and enter the story with you?
One of the biggest heartaches and heartbreaks for me as other people have engaged my story is when they turn their face away. When I think about the idea of courage, it's the capacity and the willingness to stay in the hard places, even when neither of us know where to go next.
Mm,
Like, I don't need you to know exactly where to go, but I need you to be willing to stay.
mhm.
So much of our harm, my harm, is being left alone to deal with our trauma by ourselves.
Yes, and I just want to pause there and underscore that, because that is so common, and it's not often written into the story explicitly,
Mhm.
but it's there. In other words, it's not merely the trauma. It's that 13-year-old knows she cannot talk to her mother about what happened at dinner with the 19-year-old, or what happened 2 months later when the 19-year-old's grooming of her began to become violent and sexually active. It's the experience of, I am alone in this heartache. And what you're saying right now, Cathy, is that when someone's listening to your story, you need them to be with you in that moment, even if they don't know what to do with the big feelings of the 13-year-old girl.
Yes, absolutely. Because that 13-year-old girl also didn't know what to do with her feelings, but at least now she's not alone.
Yes.
She has a witness. And often our hearts are very, like, we so long for connection. We're so open to them, even in the midst of years of trauma, years of loss. Like, when we sense there's someone safe enough, none of us are fully safe, but safe enough to be able to stay with us. Our bodies are desperate for comfort.
Yes.
And just not being alone at some points is enough. Like, I've been on a pretty intense therapeutic journey in my own life since February of this past year. So almost a year now. And what she does is drops me into my stories of harm and just doesn't leave me, and then trusts that between the two of us we can work it out. Like, my body and my mind is capable of knowing the truth, of handling the truth, of being able to see it more clearly, and that she really just is then a midwife to the truth that's already in my body. And then I birth it, right? It's not hers to birth. So if you're sitting with someone else's stories, this isn't your story to birth on behalf of someone else, but you can be with them to remind them to breathe, to say, like, hey, this, you're going through a contraction, right? I mean, like, it's like, it's okay. I'm with you, I can hold your hand, but really you're there to bear witness and to suffer alongside of someone who has been alone for so long.
And even though we've already talked about this, I want to just share principle 3, which is, because you're talking about it right now. And principle 3 of effective story engagement is using the exquisite instrument that is your body. So when you started out with this, when you're listening to a person's story, you are having a bodily experience. You may not know that you are, but you are. We're always having a bodily experience, which means you're feeling things in your body as the woman talks about what it was like to be with this 19-year-old and what it was like to have her mother leave her there. You need to become aware of what you're feeling. As your friend describes, to use a different example, how she was groomed by her sexually abusive uncle. Because your body is a finely tuned instrument that can be used to such advantage on behalf of the person who's speaking.
Mhm.
And it will give you tons of valuable information about what's actually happening in the story. So if the story is about, a 10-year-old girl, you need to become a 10-year-old girl who enters that room. I remember when Dan engaged one of my stories, and I was a 11-year-old boy, and I was in a pool
Mhm.
with my mother. And when he was explaining what he did, he said, "I'm in the pool." Now, I'm not in the pool that Adam's describing. I'm in the pool that I knew as a boy, as an 11-year-old, and I can feel the water, and I can feel his mother's leg rub up against his leg, and I am having a bodily experience. So, since I bring up Dan again, this is a paragraph, but I want to read it because it gets at this. Here are Dan's words. He says, "As I listen to a story, I let my imagination see what is happening. This is so important. I don't merely hear words. I let words create scenes and images. It is like reading good fiction. You don't merely read words, you conjure in your mind the hero, how he or she looks, speaks, moves, laughs, and fights. When an action scene arises, you can feel your heart rate increase and your muscles tighten as danger is engaged. Now hear this, the dilemma for many is that this evokes too many emotions. The storyteller doesn't want to bring his or her body to the story and feel what was felt during the abuse. The hearer, the listener, doesn't want to feel the terror, the fury, the confusion, or the arousal, especially the arousal. I'm adding a lot. And here's Dan's how he finishes. We anesthetize the impact of the story by distancing ourselves. So it takes courage to let your body feel what's happening in the story.
And this is where the work of the science and the art of listening to a story comes into to bear. And so, again, like if you guys come to this conference in February, we'll walk you through the science of it. There is a lot of science that we've developed over the last decade or so around how to slow a story down in your mind, how to start to see the different components of it. But when it all comes down to it, if your body isn't available to use your imagination, if you have too much shame or contempt around where your body has been harmed, or you've been complicit, or felt complicit in abuse, then you're going to shut those parts of your own heart down. And so, what we'll also do, and what's fun about this work, is that as we teach you how to read, genre, the difference between like terror versus suspense, versus a love triangle versus a romance. Like there are these different genres when you look at the movie of someone's story. The parts that you can't feel are often the parts of your own story that you've shut down. So we'll help you understand where you have clogged arteries, and we'll go in with a stint and be like, okay, we've got to get that out. So you want to do this work? That's great, but we have to get after those parts that are keeping you from being able to be your body to be available to be a witness to these stories. And I love the fact that God's redemptive arc in all of this is that you're invited to your own healing as you desire to step into other people's healing, and they go hand in hand. And I love that. I think that's wonderful. Like I was just talking to someone in Nashville who just graduated from a psych program, and they didn't have to do any personal work around their own story in order to graduate with a degree in psychology. That is insane to me. It's insane because you cannot take anyone further than you're willing to go yourself. And so you're going to miss so many opportunities to actually feel the nuance of someone's story if your own body is shut down. And by the way, when your body is shut down, it also means you're not living your fullest life either. And so again, like I love the fact that our altruism, our desire to help others leads us directly to our own healing. I feel like that's so gospel.
So in addition to what I'm calling principles of story engagement. I've got what I call tactics. The word tactic means an action that is carefully planned to achieve a specific end. So this gets more down on the ground level. Now, what is the specific end of story engagement? Well, I mean, in a nutshell, it's increased freedom for the storyteller. You want the storyteller to be able to breathe a little better after your conversation than before. So the specific end, it's freedom from places of bondage and places of stuckness. And we want to give you a preview of some of the story engagement tactics that we will explain and illustrate in much more detail on February 19th. Here's tactic number one. You have to explore the trauma before the trauma. This is so important. Cathy, can you explain what do we mean by this and why is it so essential for effective story engagement? What do we mean by the trauma before the trauma?
Yeah. So, oftentimes when people look at their stories, they'll look for kind of the big T trauma moments. So, let's say you have, you're talking to someone and they were sexually abused by their babysitter. And so you can do a lot of good work around the engagement between the little girl and her babysitter and all this different stuff. But oftentimes the greater harm occurs both on how she was set up to be abused and be available for that babysitter, and then how the family handled her afterwards.
This is the trauma before the trauma.
Yeah. So it's how the person got set up for the abuse within their family system that made them vulnerable to the abuser, and then what happened in the system afterwards for the person who was abused. And so if you're just handling the abuse, you'll stall eventually because you're not actually understanding, because this little girl actually feels quite complicit, because let's say this little girl was really left on her own, and in the beginning when she was young and sweet and cute, her parents dressed her up and took her places and like doted on her, and then she became a little more awkward as 11, 12 year olds, and then she was left alone with this babysitter who paid attention to her and thought that she was special and made her feel connected to her body, and then all of a sudden after a few weeks of babysitting, asks her to touch his penis. Like that's how it happens. And then she did it because she didn't want to lose his affection. She didn't
Yes.
want to lose the connection that felt so good to her. So she continued to play along.
Yeah, and the temptation when you've heard a story like that is to focus on the interaction with the babysitter. And it's not an unimportant focus of the story engagement. But if you start there or only stay there, you're really going to miss what is agonizingly uh, true for this young girl, which is the setup from her parents for the abuse. And that's the trauma before the trauma.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's going back and forth between those to understand how the interplay between the two, and then the traumatic impact on a young girl's heart and where she ends up turning on herself and then making vows and agreements to say, like, I'm never going to need again, I'm never going to be that vulnerable again, or I'm a bad dirty little girl who liked it. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
there are so many places that we go in our own hearts, because we don't actually want to look at the fact that she was set up spectacularly for abuse by her family, who were a good Christian family that loved each other, right? So she can't get close enough to the family of origin work and really the cruelty of her mother in order to be able to do the real healing work, and that has to go side by side as you do story work with folks.
Tactic two, and it's related. You have to explore triangulation in their family of origin. Now, this is essential work to do before you can identify the core wars of the storyteller's heart. So, suppose someone has told you a story. I just want to give an example about, he and his dad. Now it's a man. He and his dad. They're going on a camping trip together, and on the way home, dad erupts in rage at his son because his son forgot to pack up a pair of his shorts. He left them at the campsite, and dad's furious. Now, as the listener, this needs to confuse you because of the disproportionate nature of the dad's anger. And you need to follow the trail of your confusion. Why did dad get so angry over his son leaving a pair of shorts at the campsite? Human beings are intentional creatures. We do things for a reason. And there's a clue in the story, but it seems almost unnoticeable. It's a little sentence when dad says, "Now your mother's going to go buy you another pair of shorts, which we can't even afford." So, as the listener, you have several pieces of data. First, dad is disproportionately angry about his son leaving a pair of shorts at a campsite. Second, as the listener, you feel confusion at that disproportionate anger, which makes you curious about what's really behind the anger. And the third piece of data is that dad brings mom into the equation. Now, is this enough data to know that this boy has been triangulated by his mother? No, of course not. But it's enough data to prompt you to inquire about the possibility. So, one of the things that's important to understand is that the stories people bring you will rarely spell out the dynamics in clear black and white. They're not going to tell you the trauma before the trauma, but they will inevitably, without even knowing it, they will. This is what's so profound about story work. They will drop clues that you need to pursue like a detective at a crime scene. As you hear that, Cathy, the whole category of triangulation, is it something that you feel like is necessary to explore? And if so, why?
I'll take it a step back and say you have to start to understand the motive of harm. So there's always a reason why we're chosen for abuse, why things happen. Like things just are not benign, not as much as we'd like to think. And so, a lot of times freedom for someone else's story comes when they realize that there was intentionality behind the harm. And so, like, for that little boy, that he's excited that his dad paid attention to him and wanted him to go camping, right? Because this is a rare thing. Camping is the only thing that they get to do together because of him being kind of set up and triangulated with his mother. So this boy knows that there's a lot on the line, and is also desperate for his connection with his father because he has this sense that his dad is constantly angry at him, on edge, because again, what this father is seeing is that this boy holds all of his wife's attention and love, and this father is angry because of this boy is now a rival in his home, right?
Yes, yes.
And so the way that he punishes him is through his rage and humiliation. And you can't understand that unless you understand motive. So what's his motive? It's because he sees him as a rival and wants to cut him down and wants to belittle him so that he'll be less of a man and won't rival his wife's attention as much. So unless you're willing to look at the dark side of that, it's just like, oh, I'm sorry, your dad was so angry. It's like, well, that's not helpful.
All right, last tactic, at least for today. We'll go into many more on February 19th. And and this isn't something that you do at the beginning, but it's something that eventually needs to happen anytime you engage somebody's, story. You have to explore the storyteller's posture toward the boy or girl in the story. Eventually, maybe not the first conversation, maybe not the second conversation, but Cathy, what do we mean by the storyteller's posture toward the boy or girl in the story? And why is it so necessary to explore this?
We do a lot of damage to our own hearts because of how we've been harmed. So, like, let's go back to that boy in the campsite. Because his father has set him up for humiliation, he is now filled with contempt towards that boy who left his shorts at the campsite, right? And so you have to start to understand clues of like, how do you feel about that young boy, and do we have compassion for the agony, the harm, the heartache that we've suffered? And often, when you get close enough, you realize you have a lot of contempt, a lot of shame, and you don't want to get close or really understand what that boy suffered, because it's easier to hold yourself in contempt than it is to grieve and understand the true harm that came to you through parents whom you love. So you'll turn on yourself before you'll start to actually tell the truth of what it meant to be in your family, because you feel like you're being disloyal to your parents, and frankly you just don't want to see it because it's too painful and the implications are too vast. So we hide in some ways. It's easier to have contempt and shame towards ourselves than it is to understand how you were set up, how you were triangulated, because then that's a more difficult story around how other people have harmed you.
Okay, that's a preview of some of the things that we're going to go into in much more depth. And let's just close today, Cathy, by sharing an outline of the conference. The first half will be devoted to the following three areas. First, we'll teach through the core principles and techniques of effective story engagement. Second, we'll look at the fundamentals of how to read a story and how to think about a story, what you, Cathy, call story theory 101. And then the third thing is you'll learn how to engage another person's story with courage, with kindness, with care. That's the first half. The second half will be devoted to practice. So, what are we going to do during the second half? It's a little risky.
We are going to actually do story work with each other. So Adam is going to read me one of his stories, and then I'll engage, and then I will read one of my stories to Adam, and he'll engage my story. And so the way that both of us have learned how to do this is by seeing story work done over and over and over and over again. And there are patterns, there are themes, there are ways of relating that you can learn and start seeing. But it really is so helpful to see it done live.
And you're not only going to engage my story, but as you do so, you're going to kind of pause it at different points and explain why you're saying what you're saying or doing what you're doing. And then I'll do the same for when I'm engaging your story. So we're going to the whole point is to give people a sense of that, how do I of catching how this work is done. And it will be, unscripted and live, and we'll see where it goes. So that is what's going to happen at the How to Engage Another Person's Story conference. Thank you everyone for listening to today's episode. Again, the conference will be Zoom virtual, February 19th from 8 to 4 Pacific time. It's $129, and you can sign up on my website, which is adamyoungcounseling.com. Cathy, thank you for joining me today and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Adam. It was really fun.